Hey, what's up, everybody? It's your boy Big Dane from the Never Say Never WrestleCast, and I'm joined by very special guests, the two co-producers of the brand new documentary When Giants Walk Here. It premieres August 8th on PBS North Carolina and nationally after that on the PBS app. I am joined by Chris Lea and Cliff Bumgardner. Gentlemen, how are you guys doing tonight?
Good, man. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for inviting us on. Happy to talk about this film and what we've been working on for the last few years and ready to share it with the world.
Yes, indeed. This documentary looks very promising. It's all about the rise and fall of the arena in Raleigh, North Carolina. What inspired you guys to make this sort of documentary for everybody to see?
Yeah, man, I can kick us off. So, I was born and raised right here in Raleigh, and Dorton Arena, for anyone who doesn't know, is on the North Carolina State Fairgrounds, and it's this very unique building. You can't miss it. If you're listening to this right now, maybe Google a picture because it looks like a spaceship. It's this amazing, really unique building that is kind of an architectural model built in the early 50s. And growing up in North Carolina, you see Dorton all the time. Going to the fairgrounds when I was a kid, going to flea markets on the weekends, going to the state fair every year, and it kind of combined with something else that I've always loved, which is wrestling. Grew up a big wrestling fan, big Southern wrestling fan. But there was no wrestling in Dorton Arena when I was a kid. I would just hear stories about the days where there was wrestling in Dorton Arena. And I kind of got to a place where I wondered, why did the stories always end with there used to be wrestling here? And when I got older, I started to look into that. I started to get interested in wrestling history, started researching that topic, and it just seemed like something that would be fun to do for a film. And Chris and I started to dive in and uncovered a much bigger and more complex story than we expected that really allowed us to talk about a special era in wrestling history and how that era and it kind of its rise and fall is mirrored by what was going on in Dorton Arena. So it's sort of the small story about the big story, right? And we got to dig into that. And yeah, the film took us by surprise, the depth of the story, and we're excited to share it with folks.
Oh man, that sounds good. Because you think back to that time and era when it was like the tail end of the territories. You know, all the territories around the country. And basically, the Dordan Arena is where you had a lot of famous Hall of Fame wrestlers come through, especially going through the South. So yes, I'm sure, guys, it holds a very special place in you guys' heart. So, Chris, tell me how this project just basically just spoke to you. You know, considering that you yourself, in addition to being a sportscaster, you were also a pro wrestler at one point. Can you tell me what that experience was like for you, Chris?
Yeah, it's good, man. It was having the mix of both worlds, and to be able to be since I am a storyteller, by trade on television, to do it now in this long form of a documentary was great. So what ended up happening was I started at WRAL in Raleigh on March 4th, 2020, the
Yeah.
week before the pandemic hit.
Oh,
And
wow.
so I start there, and then the next week everybody goes home. And at the time, Cliff worked there. He was one of the people who were working from home, and so we never met in person. And then later on in 2021, I got this email from him after he had already left WRL, telling me about the idea for this. And I'm from Greensboro originally, so I grew up knowing all about the Greensboro Coliseum, things that happened there, Starcade, all that good stuff. So coming to Raleigh and being a former professional wrestler, I knew that I wanted to do something with wrestling here when it came down to storytelling, because the job that I work at WRL was one of the studios where wrestling Jim Crockett Promotions would tape their television shows. Where I do sports at every day is literally where Ric Flair and Ricky Steamboat started their feud back in '82 or '83, whatever year it was. So it was like a no brainer to me. So when Cliff asked me, it was like, all right, cool. That's awesome. I can definitely help you out with that. And I just got started immediately making calls to people that I knew to see if they'd be interested to be a part of this. And so just happy that we were able to kind of take our two worlds, bring it together, my wrestling expertise and contacts within the industry, and Cliff and his knowledge of long form storytelling through documentary work.
Well, that's great, man. That's awesome to hear. So you guys interviewed a lot of legends with this documentary. You got David Crockett, former announcer and executive. You got handsome Jimmy Valliant. You got George South, George Smart, Bobby Fulton, CW Anderson, Shane Helms, Burak Erdim, and then you got Earl Hebner, who just recently made an appearance at TNA Slammiversary. So yeah, you got all these different guys. Now, was there anyone in specific that you wanted to get for this documentary but couldn't? How did that whole process work with you guys?
Man, there are so many. We had, this started out as a passion project originally, and Chris and I do this for a living, obviously, but this specific project just started out as something we were kind of doing for ourselves and to see what would come of it, and grew from there. So we didn't have a ton of resources, quite frankly, especially in the early days. I would say the top of my list was someone where we just weren't able to get due to time and location was Jim Cornette. Cornette,
Okay,
obviously a divisive figure in online wrestling these days, but an
to say the
absolute
least.
legend, and one of the defining managers in all of wrestling, but particularly that era, and had some great moments in Dorton and speaks so wonderfully on the history of wrestling and the importance of these stories. And so he was someone we really wanted, but we were kind of stuck to North Carolina, Virginia sort of area just because of resources. And that it was that way with a few people. I mean, Tony Schiavone, somebody we would have loved to talk to
Definitely.
and did reach out to, but it just didn't work out. And a couple other people, but in general, we were really able to get so many. We wanted this to be people who were there, right? We
Yes.
wanted to keep our talking heads, so to speak, to a minimum. So even some of the more, the reporters and people like that we talked to, Tom Sorenson is a name that especially North Carolina wrestling fans or sports fans may know from the Charlotte Observer back in the day. He was the guy with the wrestling byline. If you saw a wrestling article in the paper, it was a Tom Sorensen article. He was there, extemporaneously. He was one of the, or contemporaneously, I should say. He was one of the guys. So we really were lucky to speak to so many people who lived the history back then, 70s and 80s, early 90s era. And then, one of the great things, and we talk about this in the film, is wrestling is back in Dorton. And we got to chronicle that as well and talk to people like CW Anderson and Shane Helms, who grew up going to shows in Dorton and then later got to wrestle there themselves. And so it's this really full circle experience that they shared with us. And that was also really fun to capture and is a whole other angle on the story that I don't think anyone has heard yet.
I do want to add in this interesting tidbit, if you don't mind, where when you look at the film, you'll see us interview beautiful Bobby Fulton, and at that same location where we at, it was a wrestling show. Arn Anderson was there, and we
Wow.
definitely wanted to talk to Arn Anderson. And so we told him the whole idea and all that. And him and his son follows me on social media, and I follow him back, and we kind of just knew each other through wrestling circles. And Arn was just like, sounds like a great idea, but I hated Dorton, so no. He's like, I have nothing good to say about it. So that's not a dig towards Arn because we love Arn. But we were like, yeah, no, that'll be great. If you have something bad to say, that gives us a little conflict. But he was like, nah, I'm good. But we had some lofty names that we wanted to go after, and but we were able to get some really good names. And I think the right people were definitely a part of this, and it's gonna feel good when everybody watches it.
And that was the same show, actually, Chris. We haven't told the story that also Barbarian very
Yes.
politely turned us down at that same show. But you tried disagreeing with Barbarian. Like, as soon
Yeah.
as he said no, we were like, yes, sir. Thank you. Have a good night.
Yes. Definitely don't want to get on Barbarian's bad side. That's for
No.
sure.
No.
So the Dorton Arena was built in 1952, and it's pretty much considered like the Madison Square Garden of the South. You guys chronicled that in the film. I mean, has it? I mean, so we're talking about the rise and fall. Has it? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of peaks and valleys that goes along with that type of arena, throughout the years. Can you break it down and tell us how the Dorton Arena has really ebb and flow throughout the years ever since its inception?
Yeah, Dorton has a really fascinating history, and this is something that if folks are listening to this and they're wrestling fans, maybe they know a lot about wrestling there. We also talk about the building a little bit because the context is important, the history of it itself. As you mentioned, I almost said born. It was built after World War II, and it was built with very lofty goals in mind. You mentioned Burak Erdim, who's in the film. He's a professor from NC State. He specializes in Dorton Arena. It's something that he studied a lot. And the architect who built Dorton was very interested in how spaces could bring people together. Something that we probably take for granted these days is we have arenas, we have sports stadiums, we have all these things. There was a time when that wasn't really common, where we didn't have a lot of these large, particularly indoor spaces that would bring people together. And this architect, his name was Matthew Nowicki. He was Polish, and he had seen fascism very, very close up during World War II. And he believed that, hey, one way to get people together is to physically force them into the same space for a shared purpose and a shared reason in one show. And so his design of Dorton, if you look at the trailer, you can see this. Obviously, if you watch the film, you can see that it's a very open space. The way that the famous roof is designed, it is self-supporting. So there are no beams that are breaking up the space. So literally you can go wall to wall inside of Dorton, and that was intentional. And the space really achieved that. I mean, you go back all the way back to the 60s. You've had incredible musicians there, comedians over the years. Prince played there, all these wonderful shows. But at a certain point, just as sort of happened with wrestling, you got new venues. You got arenas, you got fancier places. Dorton Arena to this day still doesn't have air conditioning, right? It's sort of aged out a little bit in certain ways. It's still a magical place. You can still go see shows there every year. The state fair does a lot of stuff there every year. So it's not as active as it once was because we have all these other spaces now. But it's still fulfilling a purpose. And what we found so interesting and talk about in the film is that in a lot of ways, wrestling may be the greatest achievement of that original goal, right? Because you look at these photos. When we have some incredible photos from the News and Observer here in Raleigh that are in the film, and when you look at them, you look at the crowd, and it's the most diverse, all ethnicities, races, backgrounds, ages, grandmas on the front row next to a little kid. And there's stories of North Carolina governors who would come to shows and get popcorn thrown at them. And wrestling really was an equalizer, and it brought all these people together. And so it's sort of our belief, and obviously Matthew Nowicki is no longer with us, but it's our belief that that wrestling kind of achieved his vision for Dorton, and we think that's a special part of the story too.
From essentially from the 60s, from the early 60s until the early 90s, wrestling was there 30 years, was there every single week. There was a couple of years here or there where maybe there was some renovations going on at Dorton or whatever, so it'll move to another location in Raleigh. But for the most part, every single week for 30 years, there was something there at Dorton Arena. So people literally grew up inside of Dorton, and different generations grew up inside of Dorton. And so we wanted to help capture some of that magic and what it meant to people with the story like that.
Yes, I mean that you guys just talking about it. I mean, I can already just see how things were back then with that arena, the Dordan Arena, and it's like a bygone era when it comes to wrestling. And that brings me to my next question. Do you think that wrestling currently, modern wrestling, have that capacity to be able to recapture that same magic, whether it's in any arena, in any venue, in any city? Do you feel like that it has that capacity to be able to recapture what it once was back in that era?
I think it's different these days. Of course, like I don't think you'll ever, because of how global wrestling is. I'm not sure that a weekly stop at the same place is ever going to work, especially with how expensive things are. Like back then, tickets maybe $5 or whatever, and you could probably budget for that. Which $5 back then is different than what $5 is now, but
True.
still, it's still not like a hard thing on your wallet right now. If you've gone to an AEW or a WWE event lately, you know that if you want to be anywhere close to the ring, you're paying at least $100 per ticket. And so I don't know if you can do that every week, but I do think that there's still magic in what wrestling has been offered, all across the world. I mean, we see what WrestleMania does, having these big stadiums full of people. I mean, 75 plus thousand folks packed in a venue. We see what wrestling does whenever they go back to the old Rosemont Horizon, whether it's WWE or AEW. And that seems like a magical place. Wrestling was at Madison Square Garden recently with WWE and SmackDown, and it felt magical through the television there. So I think there's still magic within live wrestling. I think that's the wrestling superpower is the live event. Cliff can probably has similar stories, but my wife, she's not a huge wrestling fan, but she'll go with me to a live event because it's just a lot more fun. It was like that growing up with my sister. She hated when I watched wrestling. She's like, "Oh, you watching wrestling again?" But let WWE come to town and Monday Night Raws come to the Greensboro Coliseum. She's like, "Oh, you didn't buy me a ticket?" It was like that. And so because people love it live. So I think there's still magic there, but on a week to week basis in one venue, just budget wise and just entertainment wise, and there's so much going on in people's lives. I don't know if that's possible anymore.
Yeah, just to build on that really quick, I think part of it too is, and this is something that came up a lot while we were making the film, and that is very prevalent in the film, is the experience that was so different back then is it was personal. Partly because it was weekly and it was, something you went to see, and also because this was your wrestling. The Dordan Arena shows, for the most part, with a few exceptions, weren't televised. So this wasn't, a national or even a regional experience beyond the people in that building on that night. And also, most of the wrestlers lived around here. They lived in Charlotte or the surrounding areas. People knew them. People ran into them in the grocery store. There was a personal connection that, for better or worse, you're not going to get that from WrestleMania, right? It's just not possible. That's the thing that I would say in the modern era is going to be hard to replicate, but that is where your local indies come in. We are lucky enough to have a lot of local indies here in North Carolina. Chris does commentary for one called Ashe. There's also a great group who helped us out a lot in the film called AML. And when I go to an AML show in Winston-Salem, they do run some shows in Greensboro from time to time. It's about the closest I feel to going back to the territory days, where before the show you go to the bathroom and there's a wrestler in the bathroom and you see these people and these people, and there's the old lady on the front row yelling and knows all the heels by name and is yelling at them, and she's there at every single show. Like, that atmosphere does exist. It may not be as big as it once was, but that atmosphere does still exist. And so I would encourage people to check out your local indies. If you're in North Carolina, check out Ashe, check out AML, FWE Wrestling. There's a number of great ones around the state. But wherever you are, chances are there's something like that. And if you want to relive that time, that's probably your best bet, because it's just not something that you can replicate with a national company, I think.
Yeah.
No doubt. I mean, that's what it's all about. Support independent wrestling, ladies and gentlemen. They could definitely use it, because you just never know where that next star of tomorrow is going to come from. Before they hit WWE, before they hit AEW. A lot of these guys and gals ply their craft in these smaller wrestling venues. So it is very important to support that.
When I was wrestling, I came up at CWF Mid-Atlantic, where Trevor Lee, who ended up being known as Cameron Grimes, was there. One of the people that helped train me. And my training class was a guy by the name of Levis Valenzuela, who went by No Way Jose in WWE.
Yep.
I was regularly in locker rooms with Adam Page, Cedric Alexander, guys like that before they got on at WWE or AEW. So legit, like what you just said, you never know when you're going to meet the stars of tomorrow. And you never know who you're going to touch, too. I remember I was wrestling in Greensboro at a place called Firestar, and there was a little kid there that would come see wrestling events and ended up starting training at the age of 13. And now you can see him on WWE by the name of Javon Evans. So,
Wow.
it's interesting to kind of see those things change over time as well. So, you just never know who's going to end up coming out, in your local indie. So go and support, especially if you're in North Carolina, because there's a lot of great indies here, and a lot of great people who are probably going to be on top in the next few years.
Indeed, man. And that's why I say support your local indies. You just never know who you might see. You might end up seeing the next big wrestling superstar. Make sure you check out the documentary When Giants Walk Here, premiering August 8th.
And we're also pushing the PBS app, putting it right here on your screen. If you're not in North Carolina, or if you're just not in front of your television at the time when it comes on August 8th at 10 o'clock, it'll be on the PBS app. It looks like this. It already has a landing page where you can see the trailer right here and everything. So that's the big thing. That's the big thing that we're pushing. Please download the app, watch it over and over and over again. That'll help us out, and maybe some more projects can come out of it.
Make sure you go check out this documentary. It looks like a darn good one, y'all.
Keep listening to Big Dame. Let's do it.
That's right, baby. Thanks, guys.